Thank you, everyone. Our next panel is on defunding the left's federal support. Very timely topic given everything that's going on. My name is Milikh, I'm the Executive Director at the American Conservative. We're thrilled to be part of this event with a lot of friends and partners here at Hillsdale's Kirby Center. I know we have a packed schedule today, so I'm going to keep things short and let our excellent panel take the lead here. And I'm going to introduce them one by one as they go, starting right to my left, to your right. U.S. Representative Bob Good from the greatest state in the country, Commonwealth of Virginia. A native Virginian, so I can say that as a very biased person. And he has probably the most beautiful district as well. If you haven't been out to that part of Virginia, make it a point, go to Nelson County, a lot of great neighbors there as well. So check that out, but I'm going to stop talking now and hand it over to Representative Good.
Thank you. There we go, that's on now. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be with you. For those who I have not met, which is most of you, I'm a second term, just won my second election in the heart of Virginia. I live in the Lynchburg area, and I'm on the budget committee, which is kind of funny here because we don't do any budgeting here. We just spend money recklessly. And I'm on the Ed and Labor Committee. But my greatest pride in Congress in terms of association is I'm on the House Freedom Caucus. And after my first year, I was one of two freshmen who was voted to the leadership team or the board of the House Freedom Caucus. And when I ran for the first time 2 years ago, I had identified that what I thought were the three greatest threats to the country were our broken education system, K-12, as well as our college campuses. We could talk for weeks on that, of course. And that's why I asked to be on Ed and Labor Committee. Our broken immigration and border system, of course, when I was running in 20, I anticipated we would have President Trump, and we would be working to continue to secure the border and to finish the wall and things like that. But I also did the third threat that I identified I thought was the greatest threat, kind of my key issue that I ran on, was the spending. And of course, we've spent $10 trillion in new spending for the first time ever in the first 2 years of a presidency to go to $31 trillion national debt. And it's funny, it's not funny, it's sad, but being on the budget committee, when I will often point out that that's $90,000 per citizen, each of our share. And I think we would probably have a hard time arguing we've gotten much for our share of that $90,000. But literally the chairman of the budget committee, obviously on the other side of the aisle, said on the House floor, I was debating a bill, and I made that point, and he said, "Stop saying that. We're not asking anybody to pay it back." And they really don't think that it's real. So I guess I'll deal with sort of probably interweave with this, the kind of the issue of the day, at least on the House side, where we're really focused, and because I've been sort of in the fray on that to some degree with our leadership situation. And I was asked repeatedly when I started to run in 19 for the first time and into the 20 race not to support the status quo on leadership. And I'll just be a little generic on that. Don't vote for or support the status quo. And I said I would evaluate leadership based on what they do in my first term. And, do we use every lever at our disposal, even in the minority, in a close minority where we were the last 2 years in a similar situation to which the Democrats will be, at least on the House side, going into this Congress. And I would suggest that we failed miserably in our willingness to fight, our demonstrated courage. It's a word I use a lot. Courage is in short supply up here. Doesn't matter what you believe if you're not willing to take risk to achieve that which you believe. And that applies to a lot of things in life, but it applies to politics as well. We have a majority of our party that really has conservative ideology, conservative beliefs, conservative values, but we don't have a majority who are willing to risk themselves politically to fight for what they claim to believe when they're asking for your vote, for your support, when they're campaigning, when they're speaking to conservative groups. But I said I would judge us on what we did. And I'll point to three specific examples where I feel like we failed miserably. And I am supposed to be talking now, right? We're not just doing intros right now. Okay, thank you. But number one, we had the ability to defeat twice over a bad NDAA bill, National Defense Authorization Bill. And we had a rare moment of leverage as a minority party to defeat an NDAA because the Democrats could not pass it without our votes. Now, I love what we do up here in Washington. This quarter speaks to the whole debt issue that we have and the spending issue. We call a defense bill is a must-pass bill. And you get the veterans say, "Oh, I know you're excited. You're a freshman. This is how it works around here. This is must pass." I've been here. They will say this like it's a positive. I've been here 30 years. Like, I know, and that's the problem. They say it like it's a good thing. But this is a must-pass bill. But they could not pass it without Republicans. And when it first came to us, it had drafting of our daughters. It had red flag laws for our military. It, of course, had no interest in doing anything to secure our border, which I know technically is not under NDAA. It had the COVID vaccine mandates, all kinds of funding of woke ideology, CRT for our military, diversity, equity, inclusion for the sake of diversity, equity, inclusion, transgender stuff. You know, we're funding surgery, transgender surgery for military members. We're funding abortion for military members. And a lot of things that compromise readiness in the name of, again, diversity for the sake of diversity. Not surprising when we have a president who's told the military the greatest threat to the country is climate. And then we had to pass an exception to allow General Austin to become defense secretary when he didn't meet the 7-year retirement between military and civilian. He'd only met 5 years, and the House was asked, of course, we don't confirm appointments like that, but the Senate does, but he had to have an exception. And we were told we had to put Lloyd Austin in there because he was going to eradicate racism and white nationalism and white supremacy, which was so prevalent in our military. And Lloyd Austin has told the military the greatest threat to the country is white supremacy and racism in the military. My military friends would beg to differ, the ones that I know well. But we could have taken that down and defeated it and gotten a clean defense bill. And instead, majority Republicans voted for it, both times. And the ranking member on the Republican side, when we were challenging it, the House Freedom Caucus, we got about 60 Republicans vote against it. That ranking member, who wants to be chairman here come January, said we would not have passed a different bill out of committee if we had the majority. First, and it was like, first it was, oh, this is the best we could do because we're in the minority, but we could have defeated it. But he also said we would not have passed a better bill if we had the majority. It should have been taken down just because of the vaccine mandates. Just because of the vaccine mandates should have been taken down. But it's got stuff on there, by the way, electrifying our vehicles, moving to sustainable fuel for our airplanes, and all kinds. This administration probably doesn't know how Putin invaded Ukraine with the climate considerations. You know, and they literally sent John Kerry to lobby before the war, before the invasion, to consider the climate implication. Secondly, and I didn't mean to take so long on that one. Secondly, on the spending piece of it, suspension bills. You probably all know this because y'all are smart policy type people. They pass bills without the Freedom Caucus fighting against it, with the complicit approval of our own leadership. They pass bills in an empty House by unanimous consent voice vote. And we make sure we have somebody on the House floor all the time to object and force a voice vote. You know, to force us to actually do what you all elect us to do, to cast our vote as your representative on. And our own leadership has fought us on that. And then what they do when we require a voice vote, they'll lump all these bills together in what's called a suspension vote, which means an unblocked suspension means you put it might be 25 bills all together. We're all up or down, one or the other. It takes a 2/3 vote to approve them because they were passed on suspension, put on the floor on suspension. So Democrats don't have 2/3 of a vote. And we vote for them, not we, but the party votes with them and allows them to pass, gives them enough votes to pass them. And what they'll argue is, well, we've got 4 or 5 of our bills in there, so we want to get our bills passed, so we'll choke down the 15 bad Democrat bills. And sometimes they're spending billions of dollars, usually millions, but billions, growing government, encroaching on our freedoms, and spending money. We've done that on. We have not fought on the spending piece of it like we could, again, on the NDAA, on the suspension bills. And there's one other big one that I wanted to mention. It's escaping me. I got my policy guys in here, but I didn't talk about what I was going to say. But we have not done what we can and what we should do to fight the spending piece of it. It's all about the power of the purse and in the new majority. And we cannot agree to fund the very tyranny that we campaign against. We should not. We in the House Freedom Caucus have sent a letter to McConnell and McCarthy saying we will not provide one more vote, and no Republican should vote for, it's infrastructure, the thing I was going to bring up for a second, the phony infrastructure bill. But we will not provide one more vote that for any government funding that doesn't secure the border, that does not end the vaccine mandate, and that does not go back to the energy policies that were in place when this president got elected that surrendered our national economic security on an energy basis. and what we're calling for is at least a return to the 2019 spending before we ramped up things because of COVID. The Trump tax cuts have worked such that revenues have grown to nearly $5 trillion last year. We're taking in more money from the American people than we ever have, but of course we're spending $7 trillion when we're taking in $5 trillion. But one other glaring example, the 1.2 phony infrastructure bill, and I always put phony in front of that because, of course, you know it wasn't infrastructure. About 10% of it was true infrastructure, to the extent you think the federal government ought to be involved in infrastructure, but 10% of it or so. Of course, part of it was to fix racist infrastructure. Everything's racist, everything's COVID, everything's climate. But our own leadership promised Republicans would not provide the votes to pass that. And because it was questionable whether or not the Democrats had enough votes, because remember, the most radical of the crazy Democrat Party, and I know I'm redundant there, but the most radical leftists, the communists, not just the hyper-socialists, the communists were mad because they wanted intangible with Build Back Better. And remember, the senators who, forgive me, screwed us and voted for it, they said if we vote for infrastructure, then we'll defeat Build Back Better because of that. That was their justification. But we had some Republicans threatening to vote for it, and McCarthy promised us Republicans would not provide the votes for it. We had the Biden 13, is what I call them, the Biden 13 who did vote. They went on the board early before the Democrats all voted, so we passed it with Republican votes before we even knew how many Democrats were going to vote for it. And when we conservatives attacked them for betraying us, our own leadership was angrier at us for attacking them than they were at them for crossing over the Democrats to pass that bill. Houston, we have a problem. And that's why some of us are risking everything politically. We're not going to go along to get along. We're not going to prove the status quo. We need new leadership. I can tell you in absolute terms, if we elect the same people to lead us in the new Congress, we will get what we've always gotten. We'll get rolled by the Senate and by the president because, last thing I'll say, and I'll shut up, probably past my time. We must pass legislation out of the House that you all voted for us to pass, that you all want us to pass. And that does, it's like, I like what Dan Bongino says, when you get elected as Republican, you ought to do, Republican stuff. And we need to pass legislation that the president doesn't like and that the Senate doesn't like. And if they don't support that legislation, the Senate doesn't pass, the president doesn't sign it, then they're shutting down the government. Almost everything we do to you up here is bad. While pretending to do stuff for you, we're doing it to you. The less we do, the better. Call their bluff. And by the way, even with the debt ceiling, which we, I've said all along, I will not vote for a debt ceiling increase unless we've got the spending cuts with it, not promised, but with it, that will actually put us on a path to fiscal responsibility. But all they've got to do is cut the discretionary spending if we hit the debt ceiling anyway. Stop spending more than we're taking in. We have revenue coming in, just stop spending more, and it wouldn't matter anyway. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Congressman Good. That was excellent. Next, we're going to hear from Arthur Milikh. Arthur is the executive director at the Claremont Institute's Center for the American Way of Life, one of the lead organizers of today's event. He's doing excellent work there. Arthur.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much. One of the most painful things to watch about seeing the direction of our country is to see the numbers of how much the federal government actually supports the left. It's an astonishing thing. Leftist institutions, and we're always checked. We're always in a kind of, if you're playing a game of chess, we're always checked, and we never do anything to counterattack. We always just say, well, okay, we lost on this one, just like was said a moment ago, and we never do anything to counterattack. We're funding institutions that harm the country, that harm, more importantly, our constituents, and you could reverse this question by saying, well, when does the right ever get any federal money? Does it ever? Should it? I don't know. That's an open question that we should be thinking about and talking about. So if you take a step back, you see that federal spending helps, so far as I can tell, only the left and never the right. And when you look at the total of federal spending, you'd think that the federal government is some kind of leftist activist entity, kind of like, open society, but with a little more money and a little bit of a publicly less radical bent. It's astonishing. Now, the way that I think that we should think about this is by not the way that we have been habituated to thinking like accountants on the right. So we just want to cut spending. This, I think, is the wrong approach. We'll never fully cut it, but what we're doing while we're allowing this to go on is the creation, the sustainment of an activist class that is set against, let's say, traditional America. Their salaries are being funded to do this. This is their only professional obligation. And we always say, okay, yeah, no problem. And there's nothing correspondingly being done on the right. I want to give you guys just a couple of examples. I hope you don't smirk at me that I'm going to talk about universities, because this is such a stale talking point, but I want us to look at it a little bit differently. They are, by and large, without question, assets of the left. They are part of the constellation of powers that the left owns. There's simply no question about that. They loyally teach their doctrines. They loyally promote a cultural revolution. And I'm not talking about funding like these small grants that the right is, used to kind of laughing at. A couple of years ago, there was this grant for $50,000 given to some university to research feminism and glaciers. We like to laugh about that stuff, but it's a cope. It's a cope that we allow ourselves because it prevents us from looking at the overall problem. We laugh at it, we think it'll go away, and that's it. That's not a victory. In fact, taking away that $50,000 grant would not be a victory. Going after the infrastructure of the funding would be a victory. We have to think bigger and more forcefully on that point. Now, you may say, well, defunding universities, isn't that gonna be a problem for scientific research? Well, that's very much an open question. Yale University, I just know this number, other universities are exactly like this, or other elite universities are like this, gets about $500 million a year, every year for scientific research. It's a lot of money. And what they do is they pretend like they're a serious institution by hiding behind the laboratories, which, by the way, fund the rest of the institution and give them public respectability. Why should science be done there? There's no necessity that scientific research must be done at a university. In fact, a lot of the scientific breakthroughs that we've had over the past, 40, 50 years have been done at federal labs, at corporations, partly federally funded, but not on university campuses. You can push these places into insolvency, and these are serious plays if you're looking at a chessboard. It's much more serious than complaining about one preposterous grant. So what you have in these institutions is a kind of madrasa that hides behind a laboratory. And as diversity implementations, as identity politics implementations get more and more fierce, these universities, it's already known. I'm not the first to comment on this. Peter Thiel just talked about this the other day. The scientific research will get worse. And so what you'll have is actually less scientific research and more funding, pretending like it's serious. In 1970, 20% of the college-age population went to college. It was a pretty stable, normal country back then. I don't see why it can't be a return to that. I don't see why 3,000 colleges and universities should just continue to endure and spend through, burning through the remaining money in the coffer, sending us into national debt, driving this cultural revolution. And we're just like, oh yeah, no problem. No, everybody should be going to college. This is what a normal country looks like. It's not. And it's in our hands, and we should think about it as being in our hands. And the way to reconquer these things is by pushing them into insolvency, some of them, maybe more than we'd like to admit. One other point that I would like to make. So this is one big institutional, what I just mentioned, is one big institutional support that the federal government gives to what are, as I said, very clearly progressive leftist entities. There are other categories too. Money that goes directly to the activist class, directly to leftist NGOs that do all sorts of things that we would shudder at. Just as one example, something like every year, $300 million or so goes to NGOs that basically support by resettling, advocating for, offering deportation defenses for illegals. It's an astonishing thing. We're here trying to close the border, and the federal government is funding these kinds of NGOs. And we're like, oh, well, that's normal. It's not normal. No serious country permits itself to do such things. There are many, many other categories of things that where it is just a transfer of money from, normal red-blooded American pocketbooks into the leftist NGO archipelago to support them and to allow them to activate themselves, against the interests of most of America. It's outrageous. They do this through museums. They do this by enforcing DEI. They do this through, sex ed, which is really the promotion of, certain lifestyles. It's an astonishing thing. Now, the money that I haven't given you guys a number because it's actually very difficult to tabulate. But whatever number I would give you obviously excludes the money spent inside the government itself to make it even more leftist. In the military, the number is probably, it is very difficult to calculate. So let me just wrap up here, on what should be done. Well, the broad answer is, I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows, but that's where our thinking should be, treating these as assets of the left that should not be funded. In a way, you could say, well, neutrality would be good. But, what exactly would neutrality mean? Would it mean giving as much money to the right as the left and having some kind of compromise? I don't know. Would that be easier than pulling the funding that goes to the left? These are open questions. But the perpetual cultural revolution has to be defunded. And I'll just leave you with one thing. I suspect there's reason to believe that there have been, so obvious, it's like we just haven't looked into it. There have been improprieties by how this money is spent in very basic ways. A government grant is given to you in some amount to do X. Well, did you fulfill X? Has anybody looked at that? I don't think so. I mean, that would take a lot of people, but it's a very powerful tool because if you violated the contractual agreement, the federal government should be able to do clawbacks. And if you start doing clawbacks to some of these places, they would become insolvent. This is the temper of our thoughts, I think. We have to pursue these things aggressively by looking at them as assets of the left. And once you do that, there's a whole panoply of tools that we haven't fully imagined, haven't thought through yet. So, thank you.
Very well, thank you, Arthur. Last and certainly not least, we have Amy Wax. Amy is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law. She's also written a couple of great pieces for us, the American Conservative, over the years. And for all of her great work at UPenn Law, the administration is now trying to get rid of her. So I know that Amy will talk a lot about that. If you would like to support her fight against them, you can go to amywaxdefensefund.com. Amy.
Thank you. So I am here to talk about education, higher education, but not just that, K through 12. And Arthur has already addressed that to some extent, so I'm going to kind of expand on some of his points here. This is the world I know. This is the world in which I am embedded. As suggested, my institution, Penn Law, has brought disciplinary charges against me. They are seeking major sanctions against me. That might include stripping me of tenure and firing me. I'm not sure what it really entails because they're just so secretive and cagey and lacking in candor, but that's higher ed for you. But it has become a full-time job for me to try and retain my position at Penn Law. So I don't think it's any secret, or it shouldn't be, that education in general and higher ed specifically has moved relentlessly left over a number of decades. This is especially ominous and true at elite institutions, which punch above their weight and have outsized power and influence. And this includes students, administrators, who of course are multiplying as like jackrabbits as we speak, and faculty. And this increasing polarization has been documented. There's social science on this. The Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology has good data on this. The most endangered species in the world is right-wingers, Republicans, faculty at higher ed. They are really down to a handful, if that. So as a result, this ideology of wokeism has taken over We can talk about what wokeism is, but it's basically this notion that our country is irredeemably racist and evil and sinful, that our top priority should be promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that means equal outcomes for all groups, by hook or by crook, necessarily entailing a full frontal assault on the meritocracy. So that is what is going on in higher ed right now. Now, I believe that this is very dangerous to our future. This is a national emergency. And why is that? Because higher ed seeds every aspect of the leadership in our society. It seeds the professions, the corporations, nonprofits, journalism, entertainment, and everything you can think of. We are training an army of lefty-leaning individuals to go out and take over these institutions and influence them in a far left direction. So the question really here is, how can we disrupt this? How can we discredit it, and destroy it? Now, creating more ideological balance in our universities, these extremely lopsided left-dominated campuses, is quite difficult. There is no magic bullet. There is no magic solution. These are self-governing organizations. The administration and the faculty do the gatekeeping. It's very, very hard to penetrate this carapace. And of course, the universe we're talking about here is both public and private universities and institutions. At least the public ones are subject, or at least ostensibly they are subject to First Amendment restrictions and protections in terms of their treatment of dissenters or people on the right. But the private institutions, which are among the most influential and powerful, and here we're talking about the Ivies on down, they are not subject to First Amendment restrictions. Indeed, they are barely regulated at all. They are rules unto themselves. They are judges in their own case. And of course, we've seen that with the Harvard case. There are some limits, and I'll talk about those, but in general, there's very little right now we can do under law to tame these institutions. Now, going back to self-government, we do have trustees, alumni, donors, parents. We have private individuals who ought to care about what is happening in our universities. And here's the problem. Because of the way that incentives for higher ed are structured, these private overseers often don't care. They don't do anything, right? Applicants and money are what counts, and Ivy institutions and other selective institutions have plenty of both. Now, why is that? The main reason is that these universities are the entree to upper middle class life in the United States. And parents, all they care about is, as I've said before, getting little Caitlin into Princeton and getting her out. And it's like a roach motel. What happens at Princeton is not something that they want to look too closely at or examine in detail. That little Caitlin is learning at Princeton that our country is, a cancer on the face of humanity, that their parents are racist, sexist, xenophobic, paternalistic, awful human beings. The ones who are writing the checks, namely their parents, their relatives, they don't seem overly concerned with that. So one of the challenges is getting them to care. We need more awareness, I think, of what is going on, and we need more leadership from the Republican Party and Republican lawmakers on the fact that this is an emergency situation. They need to know what time it is. They need to know what actually is happening in these institutions. And I don't think they take it seriously enough. And part of the reason is that the universities have well-funded, shrewd, excellent PR departments that put out all of this happy talk about what wonderful places these institutions are, how vital they are to the life of our country and our country's future and their integrity. Of course, all of this is false. They are madrasas that are peddling woke and far-left ideology, but people just, I think, don't really appreciate that and understand that. So part of what I think we need to think about is how can we wake up the populace and how can we wake up Republican legislators to the actual reality of what is occurring in higher ed. Now, what to do about it? We've had a lot of talk today about defunding and the spending power. And I think there is great potential in the use of the spending power to put the screws on higher ed, both public and private. In my mind, private universities should remain private, and I think that conservatives have an interest in a robust private sector because we don't want the whole society to become an arm of the government. That has incredibly detrimental effects on all fronts. But the problem with higher ed and institutions like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, which are ostensibly private, is they want to have it both ways, right? They receive many hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding through loans, grants, programs, scholarship, research grants, and funds. And I think especially it's important to highlight here the scientific establishment, which Arthur has already mentioned, within the universities and how much they are dependent upon public funds, and they snorkel at the trough of the federal government to the tune of untold sums of money. And, you know, if those sums were curtailed or cut off, that would definitely get their attention. So how to do that? Well, we have in the Civil Rights Act, Title VI. Title VI says that any institutions that receive federal funds, and practically all of them do, right, have to abide by certain narrowly circumscribed set of proscriptions. Those proscriptions are discrimination based on race, sex, and the usual suspects. I would favor expanding Title VI, and this would require legislation to mandate that these institutions have to adopt First Amendment principles as a condition for the receipt of federal funds. Now, of course, this would have to be structured to make the proper exceptions for religious institutions. It would have to be wisely drafted and the like. And that would also have to be backed up by strong enforcement powers through private lawsuits and through publicly enacted remedies, which I'll address in a minute. It's also been suggested to me that there should be non-discrimination provisions incorporated into Title VI that directed at discrimination due to political partisanship and viewpoint. And of course, just today in the Wall Street Journal, there is a piece by Vivek Ramaswamy, the author of Woke Inc., and Jeb Rubenfeld, who used to teach at Yale Law School until he was defenestrated, saying that Title VI and Title VII, the Civil Rights Act, should be amended to protect political partisanship and dissent. Now, I think in some ways it's easier to do this in the workplace. It's a little bit harder in the universities where the faculty would immediately protest and say, well, we have to retain our authority to make judgments about the quality and the value of research and of the opinions that professors are peddling. That's part of our charge as a self-governing institution, so they could potentially use that to push back against protections for certain kinds of ideas. So I'm not saying this would be a smooth road, but it certainly is something to consider. Another possibility is to enact a provision that effectively mandates that the ratio of non-teaching administrative types in the university to teaching personnel be much reduced. We have seen empirically that the number of administrators, and especially in the diversity, inclusion, and equity sector, right, which is a highly ideologically inflected sector, has been a relentless trend in higher ed. And a lot of federal money is effectively being used to fund these DIE bureaucrats because every grant that goes from the federal government into universities has a generous overhead skim, right, to the tune of 60, 70, 80% of the grant that goes to the university for general support and overhead. This is a little known fact, but where is that money going? It's going into DIE-type administrators and bureaucracy. So really, we want to drastically reduce that. I personally see as the proper yardstick and benchmark what life was like back in 1971 when I started college. When I started college, there was no Department of Education, there was no Title IX, there was basically a dean of students, a secretary, and the registrar, right? To me, that was nirvana. That was the way things should be. I am a proud reactionary. I think that it is important to see the past as a great guide to the future, and in that respect, I would try to reiterate what Yale was like in 1971, which is when I started there. So relatedly, what about abolishing the Department of Education? Or, yeah, severely curtailing its authority. And when I say that, people look at me like, oh, you can't do that, right? We've heard that theme before this morning. You can't do that. No, that's not possible. And I ask, why is it not possible? We need Republicans to take a very hard look at the Department of Education, the various responsibilities that have been assigned to the DOE, reposed in it for all sorts of services and programs. I mean, you have no idea, right, what the DIE is doing and all the money that they are spending and the way in which they have, and their various parts, have become entrenched. And ask the question of, why can we not just with the stroke of the pen get rid of it, go back to the time when we didn't have it, when frankly I think education was better, and certainly the university education was better than it is now, because I have a point of comparison. I was there, and now I see the way my students are educated, and you know, there's just, believe me, it was better back then. That's what I tell my students.
Amy, I hate
anyway.
to cut you off. We do have a tight schedule, so if you can just
Okay,
wrap,
so
that'd be great. Thank you.
let me wind up then. Finally, tame the accreditation organizations, right? The government on the state and federal level is farming out authority to private organizations like the ABA, Graduate Medical Education Association, the American Medical College Association, undergrad and university accreditation organizations, and they are layering on these DIE far left priorities, right? I could tell a million stories about that. That absolutely has to go. But I think the final theme here is we need strong leadership and audacity. We need an administration to come in, you know, and from my mouth to God's ear, a Republican president who says to his henchmen, and women, my top priority is taming higher ed. That is what the Justice Department has to do, the Civil Rights Division has to do, the Department of Education has to do before we abolish it. We have to defund and cut off all of these funds that are going for leftist programs and priorities in higher ed. We have to make it work and we have to make it hurt. And that is what I want you to do. I didn't get to give my talk about how we should abolish sex education. That's a whole nother topic. That also goes back to when I was a kid. I found out how babies were made at the age of 14 from my friend Bonnie Szymanski, and look how great ours turned out. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Amy. Thank you, all of our panelists. We may have time for one, maybe two questions if we can keep it very brief. So please raise your hands, wait for the mic, which hopefully you've figured out how to use better than I did until now. One quick note for our panelists too, don't be the latest to fall off the stage when we get up. Just remember,
Yes.
it's very small. So yes, question right here.
Thank you all so much for this important panel, because I think fighting in the federal budget is one of the most important fronts in the culture war, because virtually every single line in the federal budget not only funds their institutions, but advances the left's policy goals. So I was hoping you would be able to address the aspect of the budget that makes up most of about 60% of federal spending, which is socialist transfer spending that just gets individuals and families addicted to the federal government and big government. Thank you.
You know, so much of our budget, as you know, is called mandatory spending instead of discretionary spending, but we get to decide what's mandatory. So none of it's really mandatory. And one of the big problems that's caused, and I'll be brief because of the fact we're short on time, but one of the problems that we have economically as well as from a labor standpoint is we are paying people increasingly not to work. We've taken all the work requirements away for able-bodied citizens to receive government subsistence. So we've grown the subsistence class, we've grown the housing subsistence, we've grown the welfare subsistence, and we've developed we have 60% labor participation rate as a result of it. And so we have to go back to work requirements for able-bodied folks, of course, in a temporary nature too. We're a compassionate and prosper enough nature that country, I should say, that we can provide a limited, reasonable safety net. But you're exactly right. We should have zero-based budgeting, and by the way, and not start with, oh, this is must spend, mandatory spending. I'm part of the RSC Republican Study Committee that has put out the only budget, and it's actually a budget that does balance, that we're trying to get the entire Republican Party to adopt as well. But we deal with both mandatory as well as discretionary.
I'm just going to mention one thing, which is we need to take a really hard look at the whole concept of student loans for higher ed. Okay, and just the idea that we need more and more students going to college. It sounds very harsh, but to cut that off and say, that is just a lifeline and a funding line to higher ed, to raise tuition, to expand their administrative state, deep state, to implement all these far lefty programs. That is what it is going for. And then to seed the rest of society with these bad ideas, I really think that just has to stop.
Yes, I think I got one more question over here.
In terms of the leadership vote in the House, Kevin McCarthy can only afford to lose a handful of Republicans, right? So can you kind of walk us through that a little bit, how that might play out?
I tried to do this as quick as possible. I did a couple of interviews today where one of them started with, well, he won the vote. He did not win the vote. He got 188 votes. 36 Republicans did not vote for him yesterday. 31 voted for Andy Biggs, who would be an excellent speaker, by the way. And 5 others voted for just 5 different votes for 5 different people. So 36 did not vote for him. 188 is a long way from 218. It's clear no one has 218. What this does, in my view, is we turn the page and we're beginning to, in my view, interview other candidates now, or we should be anyway. So that was just a nomination for the other leadership positions, majority leader, majority whip, conference chair. Of course, they become that representative for the Republican Party. But Speaker is Speaker of the House, not of the party. And so you have to have 218 on the House floor. We tell the country, tell America, by voice vote, who we're voting for individually. And that's where the courage really sets in, by the way. But hopefully before then, we'll have cobbled together a coalition of support for someone for 218 that would be the strongest possible person we can get. So between now, there's 49 days from today, is January 3rd. I think the quicker we turn the page and make it clear that we're not going to have the status quo, then we'll begin to have folks being willing to raise their hand and say, maybe it could be me, as long as they're in fear of the status quo being maintained and they're in fear of retaliation, then that's not going to happen. So I think there's enough of a group to try to force change, and I think I am optimistic on what will happen.
All right, well, we need to leave it there, but don't go anywhere. We're going to roll right into our next speaker. For now, though, please join me in thanking our panel.